politics. I grew up here in Oakland County exclusively. My family has a farm in Holly, Michigan. We had a meat company called High Grade Foods in downtown Detroit. So we're hot dog people. We did all the meat for Nathan's hot dogs for the first 50 years, and we invented the ballpark Frank at Tiger Stadium. So we're hot dog people. And my grandfather drove up Dixie Highway in 1956. There was no I-75. And he bought a beef cattle farm with about 400, 500 head of Black Angus cattle. And that was in 1956. And since then, that farm has been the Slotkin ancestral home and where I lived when I was a little girl. And it's where my husband and I now live. That's my husband, Dave, over there. He'll give a wave. Oh, sure, we can clap for Dave. Let's clap for Dave. My parents got divorced in the 80s, and I moved around Oakland County. So I lived in a bunch of places in Oakland County. But my professional experience is exclusively in national security. And that is because of an anniversary that just passed, 9/11. There is no other way to say it other than, for me, 9/11 was a big decisional moment of inflection. And that is because I had just moved to New York City. I had just started, I was in my second day of graduate school at Columbia University when 9/11 happened. And I'm sure every one of you in this room knows exactly where you were, who you were with, what you were doing. You can remember the day's events like they were yesterday. And for me, when the smoke cleared that day and the F-16s left the airspace above New York, we took in people in our floors, students who couldn't get home across the bridges and tunnels. We ran and donated blood. We thought there'd be a lot of wounded. By the end of that day, I knew that national security was what I was going to do as a career. Within a year of that, I was recruited by the CIA to be a Middle East analyst. And within a year of joining up at Langley, I was voluntold, as we say, to go to Iraq, right? I'm sure everyone in this room has been voluntold. I'm sure Eileen maybe has voluntold a few of you to do a few things for this event. I'm not sure. But I was voluntold to put on my body armor. I was trained in a Glock and an M4, and I went out with the military and our diplomats, and I was trying to help them understand the militias and the terrorist groups that were shooting at U.S. forces in Iraq and plotting against the U.S. homeland. I ended up doing 3 tours in Iraq. So I would go for 9 months, I would come back. I would go and I would come back. And in between, something that is very important to me as a person and as a candidate is I was working for whoever was my commander-in-chief, whichever party was in the White House, right? I was a civil servant. And I started my time in government under the Bush administration, and it continued through the Obama administration. I actually had the opportunity to work at the Bush White House, right? I worked for President Bush, and then he left on a Friday. President Obama came in on a Tuesday. I stayed and was asked to stay on. And I worked for President Obama, right? And I tell people I worked 14 years in national security. I did 3 tours in Iraq, and no one ever asked me if I was a Democrat or a Republican. I never remember one person asking me because it was irrelevant. It didn't matter. We were working on the mission of protecting U.S. forces and protecting the U.S. homeland. So I tell people, you know, if you're in Iraq and you're in the green zone and you're about to take a trip outside the green zone to meet a bunch of people and it's a dangerous trip, no one turns to the guy sitting next to them and says, you Republican, you Democrat, because, you know, we can't do this together if you're that. That just doesn't exist when you're protecting your country. And it is that spirit that I think we have lost from our domestic politics. They have forgotten that they have a mission, right? And that is to improve the lives of the people here at home. Whether it's healthcare or prescription drugs, our roads, our water, that is the mission. And they are public servants. And I fear that sometimes on both sides of the aisle, people have forgotten that, right? So I met Dave, my husband, on my 3rd tour in Iraq. He was a career Army colonel and Apache pilot for 30 years in the U.S. Army. And he's still a counterterrorism planner. He has 2 daughters. I have 2 stepdaughters, and I'm extremely proud of. One is a brand new Army officer right out of West Point in Alaska. Yes, in Alaska right now. And then the other one is a brand new physician who spends about half her time at the VA, at the Veterans Administration. So for us, we are a service family. That is what we've done. And we had never done anything political before this year. You know, Dave was a military officer, I was a civil servant. We were always very careful, right? We worked for whoever was our commander-in-chief. So we had never been to a political event. We had never been to a fundraiser. We had never donated money to a political campaign. That just wasn't our world. But I think after working for both Democrats and Republicans, after both of us serving our country, no matter who was our commander-in-chief, we had this feeling that the tenor and tone of politics in Washington had become fundamentally unbecoming of the country that we served and the country that we all love. That this was something different. The tone coming out of Washington was not what we were used to, where leaders set an example, right? Leaders of all kinds. So we started thinking about running, and I say we because it is a team effort, right? It is something that we do together. But I was reticent to get in because of money in politics. I think we all know that money in politics isn't good, but I did not know the extent of it until I really started investigating running for office. I didn't know, for instance, that Mr. Bishop spent $3 million last cycle to win this election, and at the end in 2016 he didn't have terribly tough competition. That number's crazy, right? I didn't understand the scope and magnitude of the money in politics. And David, we had never asked anyone for money. I had never done a fundraiser, so I didn't know if I could raise money. So I was reticent to get in until May of last year. For me, healthcare is extremely personal. I'm sure it is to most people in this room. And that's because of my mom. My mom was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer in 2009, and when she was diagnosed, she unfortunately did not have health care. She had let it lapse. She struggled with health care her whole life. She had breast cancer when I was a little girl, and she survived, but for the rest of her life, she had a pre-existing condition. She had that cancer. My parents got divorced, and in 2002, my mom here in Oakland County lost her job. So she lost her insurance. And because she had that pre-existing condition, she could not afford private insurance on the open market. So my mom went for 5.5 years without health care. So 5.5 years without a checkup, without a gynecological exam, without someone saying, you know, you had breast cancer as a very young woman, you should really get a hysterectomy or checked every 6 months. In 2008, my brother and I said, you got to have something to cover you, and we helped her get insurance. It was $1,000 a month with nearly a $10,000 deductible. It's her highest bill here in Oakland County, higher than her rent. And in the summer of 2009, July of 2009, without us knowing, she let it lapse. She paid another bill. And in September of 2009, she walked into an ER and was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. So I'm sure everyone here has some experience and knows what it's like when a loved one gets a terminal diagnosis, right? It was my first time, my first parent to get sick. Your life, as you know it, explodes, right? Everything you do in your social life, everything you're focused on at work, everything you do in your life falls away, and you are focusing on that loved one and how to extend their life. And that same week that we were dealing with my mom's terminal diagnosis was the same week that they had her out on a gurney for some specialty exams, and they would not wheel her in without thousands of dollars in checks. And we spent that first month of that diagnosis dealing with it and then beginning the paperwork to file for her to declare bankruptcy. So when I turned on the TV last May, I'm not sure if people remember this, there was a Rose Garden ceremony. It was carried live on TV, and the House of Representatives stood on the White House lawn. And they had just voted to repeal the ACA, right? And let's be honest, the ACA is not perfect. There are a lot of problems with that legislation. There are a lot of people who are currently, they have health care, but the premiums and the deductibles are so high they can't actually access that health care. We have to be straight about that. But to repeal it without a plan for what came next, that to me was it. And I could see Mr. Bishop in the 3rd or 4th row behind the leadership, and for him it was like it was Christmas. He was smiling and beaming and proud that he had just voted to repeal the ACA without one town hall in this district. He has not met in a truly public forum since the last debate that he had in 2016, 22 months ago, without one meeting with doctors and nurses. He refused to meet with the Alzheimer's Association. He refused to meet with parents, particularly from the Clarkston area, who have young people, children who have special needs. He refused to meet with anyone. And I saw him smiling, and something just broke for me. And I turned to my husband, Dave, and I said, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to ignore your constituents, vote against their interests, and keep your job, right? Your constituents are your boss. That's what public service means. You work for people, not big corporations who give you big donations or big super donors. You work for the people. And none of us would get to go to work every day, ignore our boss, not fulfill our basic job description, and keep our job. We'd all get fired. And in the military, they have a term for this, right? When you do not fulfill your basic job description, it is called dereliction of duty. It is a fireable offense. And we decided that day that we were going to fire him. That's what we're going to do. So, yeah. So I got in the race in July of 2017. We've been running since then. We've had over 150 public events. We have 3 offices set up across the district. We have over 1,000 volunteers, okay? People are active. People are engaged. The key issues in the district that I hear about every day, and even some of you have already raised it with me today, are healthcare, prescription drugs, and the cost thereof, right? We are not settled as a nation on how we provide healthcare to our people. But we know that the costs of healthcare and prescription drugs go up more than 10% every calendar year, and they're squeezing people and their ability to save for retirement, help their kids go to college, and it needs to be dealt with as a nation. We've called for a couple of things in order to deal with those underlying costs. Number one, a buy-in to Medicare for anyone at any age, right? And I believe that if people are, if people are offered the opportunity to have good care at a good rate, it'll become the most popular program in the country. And then something that is extremely simple for our politicians to do, allow Medicare to buy drugs in bulk, right? To negotiate and use that power to negotiate for lower prices. I'm on military insurance. The VA is allowed to negotiate prices and buy drugs in bulk. So if I get an infection in my foot, and I have to go get a prescription, and someone on Medicare has an infection in their foot and has to go get the same exact prescription, same exact CVS, I pay roughly half to 2/3 of what that Medicare patient pays. And Medicare is much bigger than the VA. That's just pure greed. That is the prescription drug companies buying and selling our politicians and keeping them from making decisions, simple decisions. That one could be solved overnight, but they're not touching it, because they get all kinds of donations from the prescription drug companies. The other issue I hear all about, obviously, infrastructure, are roads. The average Michigander spends $540 of their own money a year to fix their car based on the destruction that comes from our roads. But the other one that we need to talk about more and more whenever we can is our water infrastructure, right? I don't think anyone is missing the irony that in the greatest concentration of fresh water in the world, we cannot reliably provide clean drinking water to our citizens. And Flint was one example, a poisoning of an American city. But now all across the state, we're finding people with PFOS and PFAS in their water, lead counts higher than Flint. We have 11,000 PFAS sites in the state of Michigan. Right now, the waiting period to get your water tested is 6 months because everyone wants to know what's in their water. And I will tell you that if we do not have major infrastructure dollars coming into our state to help us with our water infrastructure, Michigan may be the first state in the country, ironically, that has to have the existential conversation, do you get clean water out of your tap because you're a tax-paying American citizen? Or is that something only wealthy communities get? Is it a right or a privilege? And I believe clean water out of your tap is a right. But if we do not do something about it, we're going to have the conversation about whether that's still the case going into the next 5 or 10 years. And we're the Great Lakes state, right? Last thing, the role of money in politics. So we talked about this. I would say it's one of the things that surprised me the most, both in terms of how insidious it is, but also how angry it makes the average citizen. And I will tell you that we knock on a lot of doors, and there are lots of people who will say, you know what? They will tell you proudly they don't vote. They'll say, I don't vote. I don't vote. And we'll say, like, oh, what? Like, come on, what? And they'll say, the whole system's broken. It's bought and sold. Both parties are a mess. Raise your hand if you know someone like this. I'm just interested. If you know someone. Okay. That to me, I am in the national security world. That is a threat to our democracy. if we have large numbers of people stepping back and saying, you know what, I don't care, I'm not engaged, I don't want to be a part of my system, that is a threat to our system and to our way of life. And the only way that we're going to get those people to feel like they want to vote again is if they actually believe that their politicians aren't bought and sold, right? We have to just accept we need a new culture in Congress on both sides, on both sides. So I made the decision, we got to be frank. You got to be straight about it, right? You can't say that we don't have politicians taking money from big corporate PACs from both sides of the aisle. We do. And so I made the decision back in January that I am not going to be taking corporate PAC money into this campaign. I made the decision. And I wanted it to be crystal clear that I was the only one who was deciding how I was going to vote. And that my vote could not be bought by a big corporation, right? And that's in contrast to Mr. Bishop, who's taken over $1 million of corporate PAC money, particularly from the Healthcare and Prescription Drug Agency. So we shouldn't be surprised that over his 21-year history, he has constantly preferenced those companies over the average citizen, right? And one of the things that I was talking about in the crowd here before we started is we have lost our sense of empathy for other people. And that's not a weak thing. That's not a niche thing, right? Our politicians, we are their bosses, and we have to understand that they have a responsibility to hear from us and hear our stories. That is how we communicate as people. We tell our stories. How many people told me stories just in the 20 minutes before we got up here? If you don't access and talk to your politician and they won't come and talk to you, that empathy starts to break. So one of the things I think I hear the most, and particularly from the Republicans who are supporting our campaign, and there are quite a bit, is they're interested in the issues, but more than anything, they know that the tone of politics is off. They know in their bones that that lack of empathy, that vitriol coming out of Washington is not how they taught their kids and not how they learned in church. And so one of the things we talk about all the time is I really believe in Michigan, we are not a polarized state. No one wants to be polarized, right? Growing up, my dad was a Republican, my mom was a Democrat. I never remember them fighting about politics. They fought about plenty of other things, but not politics. And because we're a purple state, right? We can be Democrats and Republicans, and you don't have to have this vitriol. And I think adults can disagree, and people have forgotten about that. They can do that civilly and responsibly. Okay, last thing, how we're going to win it, and then I'm going to transition over to Megan and Nick. Because I can be a perfectly okay candidate, but if in a district like this, if you don't have a plan to win, if you don't have a strategy, it's interesting but not relevant, right? You got to have a plan. So we have these 3 offices. The closest one to here is Clarkston. We also have one in Rochester and then one in Lansing. And the way that we flip this district is by great voter turnout, right? Making sure those people who don't think about voting in midterms actually come out. And I'm sure you all know people who vote in presidential years, but not midterms. You got to talk to them, people. And then persuasion, going to people who probably know in their bones that what's going on right now doesn't feel right. It's not in character with our country, but they don't know what their alternative is. And that takes a really organized field campaign. People like you all doing something that you've probably never done before, getting on a phone for a 2-hour shift and calling people, texting people, canvassing, writing postcards. That kind of personal human-to-human interaction is the thing that will win or lose this election. Because people want to know that they're still human beings that are trying to represent them. They want to have that connection. I'm going to turn it over to these guys, but if you want to do a couple things to help us even before you leave today, number 1, it's sign up for 1 shift. I know it's something new. Trust me, people. I never did any of this 18 months ago, right? I know it's something new, but signing up for 1 2-hour shift just to try it would be a huge help. And then putting something out on social media, right? Taking a quick picture right now and saying like, I heard this woman, her name's Elissa, she can string a few sentences together. If you're in this district, you may want to check her out, right? Our ads are up on TV now, so people are starting to know our names. Personal recommendations are extremely important, especially for people where you don't know if they're Democrats or Republicans, right? You just tell them, hey, I heard this woman, she's all right. So thank you for your time. Thank you for being engaged citizens. Thank you to Eileen for organizing an amazing buffet breakfast. Yeah. It's like better than, it's amazing. Thank you for being engaged citizens. We can do this with all of us together. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.